All right, good afternoon. Let's go ahead and get started. Like a finely jeweled Swiss watch, we're right on time here. The train's in Italy. Okay, good afternoon. Great to see you all. I know many, probably most of you, but for newcomers, I'm Steve Slick from the Intelligence Studies Project. Welcome to today's book talk with the author of Vigilance is Not Enough, The History of U.S. Intelligence. For those of you who have not yet read the book, it's truly a monumental work and fully satisfies its ambitious title. I read slowly and think even slower, so I devoted the month of June last summer to vigilance. I'll confess that I'm still not sure if the vigilance in the title refers to the need for intelligence on the plans and intentions of our enemies, or whether this is actually a warning to all of us to keep an eye on our powerful and secretive intelligence agencies. Probably both. Before I turn the floor over to Mark, let me flag several upcoming events for your attention. It's the heart of the fall semester, so there's a great deal of teaching and learning underway here on campus, but also several fascinating events on campus for our intelligence and national security students. Next Tuesday, starting at 5:30 in the vast lecture hall downstairs, Strauss Center's Adam Klein will moderate an event with New York Times columnist Christopher Caldwell concerning free speech, populism, and censorship in Europe. The Strauss-Clements Centers are partnering in this event with UT's New School of Civic Leadership and the Civitas Institute. On October 27th at noon, also in the vast lecture hall, Strauss Center will host former White House counsel and NSC legal advisor Josh Geltzer for a conversation on hostages and how the U.S. government works to free Americans who are wrongfully detained overseas. Finally, I encourage you to mark your calendars for November 13th, when the Strauss-Clements Centers and ISP will resume our pre-COVID practice of organizing an annual Texas National Security Forum with a full day of speakers, interviews, and panel discussions on defense policy topics. This year's keynote conversation will be with Bob Gates, former Secretary of Defense, and more importantly for this audience, the former Director of Central Intelligence, back when that post still existed. So turning to today's guest, this may actually be the rare case where for most of our students, the speaker, in fact, needs no introduction. Our undergraduate and graduate intelligence students spend quality time with Mark Lowenthal virtually every week. In addition to Dr. Lowenthal's History of U.S. Intelligence, he's also the author of this book, From Secrets to Policy, which is the textbook that most of us assign in our general courses. Now, we view ourselves principally as educators here. In that capacity, it's hard to argue against the claim that Mark Lowenthal has introduced more English speakers to American intelligence over the last quarter century than anyone alive. In addition to readers of Vigilance, hundreds of American college students each year read From Secrets to Policy. And this doesn't even account for Mark's own teaching at Johns Hopkins University and his impact as the founder and CEO of the private sector Intelligence and Security Academy, where hundreds and hundreds, likely thousands, of newly hired and mid-career government analysts were taught their craft. So this is a remarkable legacy of educational impact. Mark's teaching and writing is informed by practical experience and a series of senior government posts. We could take all the allotted time to discuss Mark's career, but that would be wasteful. I'll simply remind you that Mark was appointed the Assistant Director of Central Intelligence for Analysis and Production, where he's credited with designing and winning acceptance of the National Intelligence Priorities Framework. This is, for those of you not familiar with the intelligence community, IC's annual to-do list, things the policymakers need them to collect against. He served previously as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and spent time in the legislative branch, serving as the staff director of the House Intelligence Committee. Mark is a Harvard-trained historian. If anybody's tempted to test Mark's mastery of the subject, I would discourage that, since he was also the winner of the 1988 Jeopardy! Tournament of Champions. I've invited Dr. Lowenthal to speak for a few minutes about the book or anything else that may be on his mind. Then he'll field your questions. Be certain to identify yourself and feel free to highlight your favorite chapter from Secrets to Policy. Just don't complain about the price. Mark has no sense of humor about that. You'll blame it on the publisher. I've tried. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Mark.
No, I don't set the price. Honestly, in fact, I don't even know what the price is at this point. Thanks to Steve for inviting me down to Austin to meet with you all, and thanks to Kim for all the work she did to make this happen. So I'll talk a little bit about my book, and which some of you I see here lugging it around. Not only do you learn something, but it's really good for you physically. You get a lot of exercise. It's heavy. When Gibbons was writing his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he delivered the first volume to his patron, and the Duke said, "Another damn thick square book, eh, Gibbons?" And I kept thinking about that when I got copies of my book. So, why did I write this book? What prompted this? Actually, I had a student say to me, "Why did you write this book?" As though I had done something to him. But I was in the midst of selling my company, the Intelligence and Security Academy, which I'd been running for far longer than I thought, and my wife and I were wondering what I was going to do next. And I was talking about writing a sort of companion piece to the intelligence textbook, going back to my first intellectual love, which is military history, and writing a military history textbook. Mara said, "Nah." She said, "Has anyone ever written a good history of U.S. intelligence?" There's been a couple. Are they any good? I said, "Oh, they're okay." And none of them are current. She said, "Well, that's the book you ought to write." And I think she came to regret that to some extent, but it really was Cynthia's idea. The book is dedicated to Cynthia. She read every chapter. She proofread every page with me. And so she was really integral to this. So the book spans the years from 1753 to 2024, beginning when Major George Washington of His Majesty's Virginia Colonial Militia was sent into the Ohio country, meaning Western Pennsylvania, to find out what the French were doing. I see this as the beginning of American intelligence. Now, I decided the only reasonable way to do this book was to research one chapter at a time, and research that chapter and write that chapter and then go on to the next chapter. So that's what I did. And when I say write, I mean write. Avec une plume, with a pen. We were talking about this at lunch. All right, students, listen up. Put your computer down. You think better with this, and you write better with this than with that. I don't mean to pick on you. That's mechanical. This takes thought. So yes, the entire book was initially handwritten, honest to God, every last line, including the bibliography, with a fountain pen. Anyway, so the research plan was moving along. I was doing great until COVID hit. The CIA library shut down, the Library of Congress shut down. I was up to middle Eisenhower, so I had a really long way to go. And what saved my bacon was the fact that I'm on the faculty at Johns Hopkins in Washington, and they were able to have books brought down from Baltimore. You put a mask on, you ran into the building, you picked up the books, you ran out again. Otherwise, the book never would have finished. And so that was the research plan. So I read a lot of memoirs, very few of which I can recommend to you. Presidential memoirs are often very tedious. There are some exceptions. Harry Truman's memoir of his first year in office is spectacular. It's really worth reading. George H.W. Bush wrote a book with Brent Scowcroft about their foreign policy decisions. That's very good. And George W. Bush's memoirs I found surprisingly good. I guess he did it differently. He did it topically, as opposed to chronologically. Secretary of State memoirs are really bad. It's like reading travel logs. Well, I got on a plane, I went over here. Then I went over there. Did you actually think about foreign policy? Did you have a scheme? Was it just like a travel plan? There were exceptions. Again, Dean Acheson's memoirs, President of Creation, spectacular. Henry Kissinger's memoirs. This is interesting. His memoirs of his years as a national security advisor in Sec State are 3 times longer than the memoirs of the 2 presidents he served. I think there's something in that. Because I had security clearances, in fact, I still have them, everything I write gets reviewed. So I submitted everything to the reviewing process. The reviewers are very kind. First of all, they know me. I write a lot, and they know that I don't screw around with this stuff. They agreed they would read it chapter by chapter, which saved a lot of effort. The early chapters came back really fast. And when I got back, like the Civil War chapter, which turned around quickly, I said, I assume when we get to the modern period, this slows down. And they said, count on it. But I have to say, a lot of people will complain about the review process, and I don't have any complaints. I do have some funny stories. The most amusing one is in the chapter on Kennedy and Johnson. I mentioned that we had Jupiter C missiles, ICBMs, deployed to Turkey and Italy before the crisis began. And DOD said, you can't say that. And that night, I sent them back cables from the published Foreign Relations of the United States, where ambassadors are talking about this. And then I found a DoD unclassified study online talking about this. And it still took DoD several weeks before they said, well, okay, I guess so. But seriously, I did not have a lot of issues in the review process. The most interesting nugget I found had to do with this famous story, which a lot of you know. Henry Stimson in 1929 shut down the State Department's decoding effort, which was not known as the Black Chamber at the time. Anyway, and his action is associated with this quote, "Gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail." Yes, but he didn't say that in 1929 when he shut it down. He said that in his memoirs 19 years later. Now, McGeorge Bundy helped Stimson write his memoirs and said that's how Stimson felt about it when he did it. But the quote is not contemporaneous with the event, which I thought was very interesting. And there's an interesting sort of second story to this. In 1940, as Roosevelt was deciding to run for a third term, he brought two Republicans into his cabinet. So you have, it looked better. So he brought in Frank Knox as Sec Navy and Stimson as Secretary of War. Stimson had actually been Secretary of War under Taft. And the Army cryptographers had broken the Japanese Purple Code. And now Henry Stimson, who shut down the State Department's coding, is now the secretary. So they went to see Pa Watson, General Watson, who was Roosevelt's appointment secretary, and said, what do we do? We broke the Japanese code. And Watson's response was fascinating. Don't tell him. Don't tell the Secretary of War. Kind of interesting. So they didn't tell the Secretary of War, and they briefed General Marshall on what they had done. And Marshall said, this is great. You have to tell the Secretary. Okay. And so they told the Secretary and said, this is wonderful. We're lucky to have some people like you working on this. So clearly Stimson's issue wasn't with code breaking. His issue was who was doing the code breaking. It was not something diplomats should be doing. Great for the military to be doing. The second most amusing anecdote I found was in the run-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a special national intelligence estimate written about what is Khrushchev going to do next. That's the kind of thing we write. And case D was, paragraph D was, put ballistic missiles in Cuba. He would never do that. He'd have to know how we'd get upset. He'd have to know it had bad consequences, and then he did it. And Sherman Kent, the great god of intelligence analysis, our intelligence analysis school is named for him, said after the event, we couldn't believe Khrushchev would make that mistake. So in other words, the estimate was right and Khrushchev was wrong. Now I have to tell you, as an analyst, that's kind of arrogant. The one line I regret writing in the book was, I wrote, William McKinley has largely faded from historical memory. Who knew he was going to have a renaissance? I mean, seriously. I mean, there was no way to know this. The unsolved mystery for me in the book was Allen Dulles and Dwight Eisenhower. Dulles was the DCI, Director of Central Intelligence, and Eisenhower was told repeatedly over the 8 years, Allen's not up to the job. He's not only not overseeing the Intelligence Committee, he's not running the CIA. He's running what was then called the DDP, the ops guys. And Eisenhower was told this again and again and again, and yet he never removed Dulles. In fact, there's this famous quote from Eisenhower, I'd rather have Allen Dulles as my intelligence officer with all of his flaws than anyone else. And I have to tell you, I can't figure this one out. During the war, Ike would sack 2 stars, 3 stars, who he felt were not performing up to snuff. And he kept Dulles on, and I decided it's in the unknowable. I just thought it was really interesting. The hardest chapter to write was the chapter on the Bush 43 administration. I was there. I was working as the assistant director. I have friends who are working there. I'm writing about my friends. I'm writing about things that we did. And that was hard. That was difficult to write about. Some was easy, but some not so much. The question I get asked more often than anyone is, who is the best DCI? And my answer is yes. Actually, some of them were really good. Walter Beetle Smith, who was Truman's last DCI, was really good. He basically created the modern CIA. He gave it the shape that it has today. John McCone, who replaced Dulles when Dulles got fired for the Beta Pigs, was very good. And he understood technology, which Dulles did not. Dulles didn't like the U-2. He thought it was cheating. He thought spy satellites was cheating. That's not how you play the game. He got on board when he realized Eisenhower liked them. Richard Helms, who was the DCI under Lyndon Johnson, and Richard Nixon, which must have been a really interesting transition. I had the opportunity to meet Helms several times when I worked on the Hill, and it was fascinating. he had a really good sense of what it is policymakers need and how much of my political capital do I spend on an issue. And I can't spend all my capital if I want to have access. And that's the main point in the book that I found about the modern period, meaning from 47 on. For intelligence officers, especially senior officers, access is everything. If you do not have access, not just to the president, yes, I know about the PDP, but if you don't have access to the president, the secretaries, the commanders, that's the end of the game. You're done. And Helms understood, in fact, he said to me when they were, he used to have lunch in the, I forget the name of the hotel, it's gone now in Washington. It's this huge dining room, and he would always sit in the back corner so he could have the entire room under surveillance. It was fascinating. But he said to me one day at lunch, he said, my authority as DCI was directly related to the perception that I could see the president whenever I needed to see him. And so if you don't have that kind of access, you're pretty much done. George Bush, the elder George Bush, became the DCI because Don Rumsfeld didn't want him to become vice presidential nomination under Ford, so he took him out of the running. And he discovered he loved the job. He said at the time it was the best job he ever had. Now he moved on to better jobs, but and he was very good. He was only there for about 18 months, but he was very good, and the building really, really liked him. Casey reinvigorated the sense of elan and mission, but there were costs. There were costs to how he did it. And he was never as close to Ronald Reagan as he'd like people to believe. But William Webster, who was brought in after Casey died, was integrity personified. And that's what they needed at that point. They needed someone to calm it down and have a better relationship with the Congress. Bob Gates, whom Steve mentioned, would have been a terrific DCI, but he ran out of time. He did not stay on after Clinton beat Bush, but he really has some really good ideas about what do we do now that the Cold War is over. George Tenet, I'm biased. George and I have known each other for 40 years. He was my boss. People don't appreciate how bad the agency was when he inherited it, in terms of morale, in terms of budgets. And he was spending a lot of time on building that up before he moved on to the community. And then 9/11 happened, and we suddenly had 3 wars on our hands. But he was very good at reinvigorating a sense that there's a director who likes us, who's interested in what we're doing. We were talking about Leon Panetta. He was surprisingly good at a job that he never would aspire to in his entire life. And Bill Burns, previous DCIA, was superb. Burns, again, understood what do policymakers need. You don't have to be a career intelligence officer to be a good senior intelligence officer, a good at running an agency. You have to understand how to deal with the policymaker. And Burns understood that in spades. The worst DCI would be one of the ones I haven't mentioned. No, just leave it at that. So as I said, the bottom line when you get to the modern period is this business of access. Very few presidents come into office with any working experience of intelligence. You're the governor of Georgia. You're the governor of Arkansas. What are you doing with national intelligence? Eisenhower clearly, because of the war, had great experience. Richard Nixon spent 8 years in Eisenhower's NSC. He had a lot of experience. George Bush obviously had been the DCI. Joe Biden had been vice president for 8 years. So they had some experience. All the others, no. And why should they? There's nothing they've done. You were a junior senator from Illinois and you get elected president. Why would you suddenly have a lot of knowledge about intelligence? And they don't have to like us. There's no rule that the president has to like the intelligence community. There are lots of presidents who really didn't like us. John Kennedy wanted to break up the CIA after the Bay of Pigs. So he was dissuaded from doing that. Lyndon Johnson compared intelligence to the dirty end of a cow's tail screwing up a bucket of milk. I'll skip the metaphor on that one. Richard Nixon blamed the CIA for his losing the election in 1960. And we always refer to those clowns at Langley. This is not a term of endearment. Bill Clinton didn't care a lot about intelligence. He just didn't. No, it just didn't grab him. George and I argue about this all the time. It just didn't grab him as an issue. He just, for whatever reason, he didn't dislike us, but we didn't have a lot of access to him. And then obviously Trump came in with the most hostile attitude of any president to intelligence. So those are some of the sort of top level takeaways from the book. I also get asked, what am I going to do next? Which I love to write, and I haven't quite come up with something yet. I've actually written a bunch of historical novels, I'm trying to find something to publish them, and if I get really desperate, I will publish them on Amazon. I have one that is already on Amazon. It's written in Greek mythological times. So when I called up the security people and said, I've written this novel, I'm going to publish it, you need to review it. And they said, what's it about? And I said, it's ancient Greece. They said, like what? I said, gods, goddesses, heroes. They said, really? I said, yes. They said, do you want to review it? I said, we'd like to read it. I said, no. Do you need to review it? They said no, and so they passed. So I'm going to probably go back to my historical novels and try and work on those for a while. So last, for those of you who read the book, I hope you enjoyed it. I don't expect everyone to agree with all my assessments in the book. That's what writing history is about. And so I look forward to having a conversation with you all. Thank you. I'm going to manage the questions, so just raise your hand and I'll call you. Yes, sir.
To open up, can you talk about your assessment of the current state of intelligence studies and where you would like to see it go, broadly speaking?
It's interesting. Intelligence studies. Well, all right. Schools are like airlines and movie theaters. Empty seats don't pay. My flight yesterday was an empty seat between me and the middle seat was gone. It's great. And so schools need to fill seats, which apparently they're doing okay here. And so after 9/11 happened, all these schools realized, oh, these students are really interested in intelligence, great intelligence courses. And a lot of them were created and nobody knew who was going to teach them. Well, get Harry, he's in poli-sci, he can teach this. And so there was a period in the years immediately after 9/11 where I would say the quality wasn't that good. I think it's gotten much better. I don't think you have to have been an intelligence officer to teach it, but it helps. And so I think it's gotten better. I think the literature, not just my book, but the other literature has gotten much, much better. So I think it's much better than it was. And I think clearly student interest in it has remained kind of high, which I think is terrific. So it got better. But there was a period in the years immediately after 9/11, it was really bad. It was just people teaching it who knew nothing about it. A lot of them were sort of Vietnam War faculty. I'm not going to teach this. I don't like those guys. And so that was the serious problem. So I think it's gotten much better, my assessment. And there are lots of programs now, which is great. Yes, sir.
So can you talk about the title of the book and why you came up with that?
Well, I had a whole bunch of different titles, none of which my editor liked. And he said, find a good quote or something. So I started doing quote research. And I found this quote from John Negroponte, who was the first director of national intelligence. And I said, I thought it was pretty good. And so it was in a speech he gave about intelligence. I sent it to my editor. He said, great, take it. So I actually know Ambassador Negroponte. I used to brief him when we were both at State. And I saw him at a funeral, at Morton Ramos's funeral. And he used to teach at Yale and he uses my textbook. And I told him about this new book. And I said, and by the way, sir, I've taken the title from one of his speeches. I said, do I get right? So I said, well, you get notice in the book. So he was talking about what is intelligence about. And it's not enough just to be vigilant. You have to be more than vigilant. You have to be active about this. And so I thought it was a good title, but it was a very difficult search initially. But it was my editor wanted a snappy title other than History of U.S. Intelligence, which he thought wasn't going to sell. I mean, we're talking about marketing at this point. Paul.
I think a lot of students might be interested, and I certainly am. Could you just talk about the process of writing a little bit? Like you said you did it a chapter at a time, but how did you tackle that, and how did you think of it, and like work hours and organization? Briefly, how did you go about it?
All right, so I'm really old school. I take notes on note cards. This guy's going, what the hell are you talking little cardboardy things with lines on them.
3x5.
No, 3x5s with the biblio. Actually, no, I had a notebook, 4x6s. And I was taught this in undergrad by Hans Trappist, the diplomatic historian. Each card is about one thing. It's not a continuous, Washington, Battle of Yada. And so I just would have stacks of these, and then I would put them in some sort of order, and I would ask myself, what is this chapter about? What are the main things? And I would write from beginning to end, just flipping through the cards and making notes, and then I would type it, which is for me is the editing process after I've handwritten it, and ask myself, okay, I know what the next chapter is. Where am I going with that chapter? And I would start doing the research again. And so my work hours, this became an issue in La Casa Lowenthal because the only way to describe my approach to this is the Italian word ossessione, obsessed. And my wife had eventually said, okay, come on. It can't be 7 days a week, 8 hours a day. And she was right. And so I agreed not to work on Saturdays and Sundays. And so, but I'm very obsessive about this. So I was working full-time each day, or going to the library full-time each day. And the Library of Congress would be open late. I'd stay until closing. I would, and also, I had this big thing in front of me. How am I else going to get this done? And so that's how I did it. And then, so I typed it all up, sent each chapter to the reviewers. As I got each chapter back, I would send it to my editor. I have to say, you're not supposed to like your editor. My editor was great. As long as this book is, he cut tens of thousands of words out of it. I mean, it was longer, and it's better. It's better for Bill's having edited. So that's how I did it. But it's a job. It's a full-time job. If you're going to do this seriously, if you're going to write something this big, it is a full-time job, and that's how I approached it. So I sort of had a lot of free time something I didn't have before, which is not weird.
Well, just to follow up, thank you, Professor Pope. Well, first of all, thank you for the wonderful intellectual products that you're gifting your audience. My question would be as well, since we're using as a textbook from Secrets of Policy, what is and we have our students here, undergraduate, also mainly graduate students. So it's all about structured writing. What is the success in writing this textbook, which is phenomenal, which, literally, take it as, it's not a form of flattery. It's just simple fact. Any program that I have visited as a faculty, is more or less using your textbook. So tell us a little bit about the structural writing.
In 1990, David Kahn, who was a great historian of cryptography, David just passed away last year. David was a friend and mentor of mine. And David was teaching a course at Columbia. He got tired of doing it, and he wanted to step down. And the chairman said, do you have anybody who could replace you? And he said, I know a guy. and so David asked me, and I said, okay, fine, I'd be happy to do it. My career goal until I got out of grad school was to be a professor. That's what I wanted to be. This whole other career happened totally by chance. I don't regret any of it. I think I had much more fun doing what I did than going to teaching full time. And so I was teaching this course. And there was no textbook in those days. And so I would do what a lot of us do. You get an article from here and a chapter from here, and it's totally unsatisfactory and it's very uneven. And I kept saying, if I have the time, I'm going to write a textbook. So I blew out my ACL, and I was lying in bed with a laptop, and I started writing a textbook. And I got it written, and a friend of mine on the Hill had written a textbook about how Congress works from CQ Press. And he suggested I get in touch with the new acquisitions editor. I approached her. And she read the book, and we had lunch. She said, who's our competition? I said, there isn't any. She said, oh, be serious. I said, I am being serious. I said, here's the name of 4 friends of mine who teach intelligence courses around the country. You ask them what the standard textbook is. And she called me back after 3 and said, we have the only one. I said, yes, we do. And so I wasn't happy with what I had. And so I wrote this textbook. It keeps getting longer, and I apologize. And the print keeps getting smaller. I have to stop making, I said, okay, I'm 77, that's one thing, but my students are in their 20s and I think the print is too small. And so I just felt there was this need for a textbook, and apparently there was. And the 10th edition just came out. It's available now. I have to tell you that I'm both surprised and pleased by how well it's done. It obviously filled a need. So every 3 years, I get a call from my editor, it's time. And I go back and edit the textbook, and I change 35–40% of the book each time.
Wow.
And so, it unfortunately keeps getting longer, which I'm trying to avoid. But there are major changes. Like in the 10th edition, which has just come out, the foreign intelligence chapter 15, is very different than the chapter 15 in the 9th edition. And so that's how I do it. What I do in the years in between is I save articles. I have this box in the closet where I used to be my son's room, and I just throw articles into this cardboard box. And when it's writing time, it sounds like how I write my book. My other book, I take all the articles and I spread them out I spread them in piles on the floor in the master bedroom, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and I just start going through them and revising it. So happily, we do this in track change, which makes life easier. And that way also the reviewers know this is the stuff you were seeing in the past, this is the new stuff. It goes to security review, and it goes to all the agencies, because it mentions basically every agency. So My clearances are at the Director of National Intelligence Office, so they handle, I give it to them and they parcel it out. And we typically don't get a lot of pushback at all. So that's the process. That's why I wrote it, because I felt I'm not happy with what I've got. I might as well. Benjamin Disraeli, the great English statesman, was also a novelist. And he said, when I want to read a good book, I write one. Well, I'm not quite that egotistical, but I realized I needed a textbook. So I wrote the textbook.
Well, thank you for doing so.
Sir.
Thank you for your insight. Could you please tell us something good that intelligence did in the pre-modern period that perhaps the general public might not know about, and something good in the current modern period which the general public might not know about?
Well, clearly our code-breaking efforts against the Japanese were tremendously successful. And the British efforts against the Germans were tremendously successful. And those two things probably shortened the war by 2 years and saved countless lives on both sides. Now, most people know about that, but I'm not sure everyone knows the depth to which, and by the way, if you're ever in London and get a chance to go up to Bletchley Park, this is a must-do if you're interested in intelligence. It's a 45-minute ride out of town. They have a nice pub. It's great. What's interesting to me is, how we use intelligence in each of the wars. I mean, Washington was really good at this. I think I make the argument Washington may have been a better intelligence officer than a field commander. He didn't win a lot of battles, but he understood his goal was just to keep the army in the field. Lincoln, basically, once he got his team, let them go with free rein. McKinley, to come back to him again, was actually a very effective war commander. And how he used intelligence, there were intercepts, there were spies. That one is very obscure. It's, Spanish-American War. A lot of people don't know about the first Red Scare in the immediate years after World War I. I had known about it because I was a historian by training, but I thought that was interesting. In the modern period, there's a good article in Analyzing Intelligence, first volume, by Roger George and Jim Bruce, and that's really their names. There's no last name between the two of them. And Dick Kerr, who was the DDCI, Deputy DCI and Acting DCI, did an assessment of how well did we do on the Soviet Union, our major focus for almost half a century. And his assessment was, not so bad. In keeping a bunch of policymakers from Truman to the elder Bush informed, and they're all very different men with very different styles, and avoiding major crises except for 1 or 2 times, and avoiding war, so we did a pretty good job. It wasn't a perfect job, but in keeping them informed and keeping things fairly steady, it was a pretty good job. I think Dick's article is very, very good. It's not easy to find, but that was a good article, I think. And obviously there are times when we screwed up. But for example, the Bay of Pigs. It was a bad plan that Kennedy made worse, is the only way to describe it. It was a bad plan to begin with. And Bissell, who was the DDO at the time, said, the DP said, yeah, we sold the plan. We just sold the plan. We didn't think about the plan. But then Kennedy took this very bad plan and had very little military experience compared to his predecessor, and he made it worse. In fact, there's this great story that in the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy goes up to Camp David and asks Eisenhower to come down from his farm in Gettysburg to talk about it. And one of the things Kennedy had done was they were planning 2 airstrikes against the Cuban Air Force, and he reduced it to 1. And Eisenhower said, why? And Kennedy said, well, I didn't want it to look like it was us. And well, I did what you just did. He laughed. He said, what part of this didn't look like us? Eisenhower, I think, is one of the most underrated presidents of the 20th century. I really do. I think he was incredibly good at his job. He was incredibly steady. He really understood intelligence very well because of the war. I think that's one of the sort of the major unknowns is how people view Eisenhower. So I think that one is an interesting story also, except the dullest thing, which I said I just can't figure out. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I was wondering what lessons you learned in studying the relationship between the intelligence community to policymakers and how that relationship has evolved over time. If you could discuss that evolution. And also, what major lessons from that relationship are most applicable to that today?
Well, it all depends on one person. The person behind the Resolute desk. Everything depends on how that person thinks about intelligence, wants to use intelligence, and whether he gives you access or not. The current president does not. Somebody told me a couple of weeks ago the current president gets a briefing twice a month. Now, steady on. Nothing in Article 2 of the Constitution, which I have here in my pocket. Nothing in Article, I carry it with me for protection. Since this is Texas and I'm going to the Barbara Jordan terminal and there's pictures of her in the hall. In the back, I've written down a quote from Barbara Jordan from the Watergate hearings. Some of you don't remember the Watergate hearings. And here's the quote from Barbara Jordan. My faith in the Constitution is whole, it is complete, it is total. I am not going to sit here and be an idle spectator to the diminution, the subversion, and the destruction of the Constitution. That is a great line. Anyway, so there's nothing in Article 2 that says you shall have an intelligence briefing. In fact, the word intelligence does not appear in the Constitution. The word secret appears twice, saying that the House and Senate can have secret sessions. So that's a major part of it. How can you get to the president? If you can't get to the president, you want to get to the other people. So, I mentioned Clinton really wasn't interested, but his subordinates were. His secretaries of state, his secretaries of defense were. So, you go to them. But that's really, that sets a lot of the tone. And among my favorite Washington sayings, there are policy successes and there are intelligence failures. It never goes the other way. So if you get it right, that's your job. If you get it wrong, you screwed up. But if policy goes wrong, that was your fault. So you have to understand where you are in the hierarchy or the lowerarchy. Who are we? Are here to serve them. We have no existence. That's what I keep stressing in the textbook. We have no meaningful existence or purpose if we are not working to support the policymakers. There is no reason to be doing what you're doing. In fact, it may be illegal or stupid if what you're doing doesn't support the policymakers. And so, but that again depends on the tone that the administration is setting and how much access and how do they like to have their intelligence. And we talked a bit about this, a bunch of us had lunch. Every policymaker has a different way that they want to get their intelligence. And I always tell officers, how do you find this out? Oh, so you know about UMINT, you know about GeoInt. There's something called AskInt. Ask the secretary, ask her executive assistant. Somebody knows how she likes to be briefed. So if she doesn't like PowerPoint, don't show her PowerPoint. If she likes to read and doesn't like to be briefed, give her something to read. So, you have to, at that level, it becomes personalized. It's a personal service. And so, but it's evolved over time. Harry Truman, for example, hated the NSC. He thought that Congress created the NSC to box him in. And he really didn't attend NSC meetings till the Korean War happened. He realized, no, this is okay. It's all right. How presidents use the NSC is interesting. Truman began to use the NSC. Eisenhower loved the NSC. It was like a staff. It was like, hey, we're back at this like London. This is great. Kennedy hated it. He didn't use it at all. Johnson didn't use it at all. Nixon, having grown up with Eisenhower, big, elaborate NSC, but it was run by one person who dominated the process. And so that's an interesting, looking at that model, how do they use the NSC? Tells you a lot about how they're going to interact with, and if you go to an NSC meeting, and Steve's been to them, I've been to them, they're not what you think. I remember the first time I went to help sell the NIPF, it's like going to a road rally. All right, these are really busy people. They don't have time for a long academic discussion about anything. So 10 minutes, Afghanistan, 15 minutes, Iraq, 20 minutes, and you run to the schedule. And you're saying to yourself, wow, that's how we're making decisions. That's really interesting. The first time I went to it, I'm like, whoa, that's strange. The other thing, the thing that struck me most about the sit room is it's very small. And it was built that way on purpose. Here's a silly historical anecdote. The sit room was built for Eisenhower. When he was commander in London, he had this huge conference room across from where our embassy used to be. It was this big L-shaped room, and he hated it. It was every cat and dog in London came in for the commander's brief in the morning. So when they were building the sit room, he told them, I want a room that's small enough just to have the people who have to be there. So I always found it claustrophobic. It's like Edgar Allan Poe, the walls are like closing in. But it's interesting because we have this system where things filter up. The working group spends a lot of time, they filter it up. And then the special group filter up. And then you get to a deputy committee, they filter it up. So you're winnowing things down and trying to get as much agreement as you can until you get to the top, where hopefully it will go quicker. And it does. But you have to realize time. I became very jealous. When I was the assistant director, my brief was basically nebulous. It was, I'm responsible. How are we doing analysis across the community, not just the agency? And I became very jealous about analysts, how analysts spent their time. I want the analysts to spend as much of their time as possible on analysis. When you think about senior policymakers, they don't have a lot of time for this stuff. When I worked in the State Department, I was fascinated by how little time the Secretary of State had to sit and think. And so George Shultz, every so often, would close his office, and he had this little side study. It was like, always reminded me of a bowling alley. It was just like this long, thin office. And he would go in there and shut the door and take out a legal pad and ask himself, where are we now? Where do we need 6 months to be 6 months from now? What do I do to help the president get there? I don't know a lot of officials who do that, though. And so they just move from day to day to day to day. And if you're the executive assistant, I say, all right, Mr. Slick, come on, we're going to go down the hall. And he's like a pull toilet. And I take him down the hall and I brief him. And I drop him in a room, I wait outside, half an hour later, come on, Mr. Slick. And he has no idea what's happening. He's got this little card, and I'm pulling him through the day. And you wonder, like, when do they stop and think about this stuff? I always found that fascinating. I mean, Schultz, I knew he would do this, but that's an interesting aspect of this, is they don't have a lot of time to think. Because they're so busy with, and that's part of the problem with intelligence. It's, well, what's happening today, tonight, tomorrow? I want to read what's happening 6 months from now. I'm not doing 6 months from now. So in that sense, it's a very stressful system. I'm not sure that quite answers your question, man. Yes, sir.
Thank you for the talk.
You're not from these parts, are you, stranger?
I was wondering if you could talk, please, a bit about the conclusions in the book about the Five Eyes relationships, and in particular, to what extent are they integral or peripheral to American intelligence today?
I would say one of the best parts of my career was Five Eyes. And I'm not saying this to suck up to you, since I don't know who the hell you are anyway. No, one of the best parts of my career was the time I spent, especially with the Brits and the Australians. The other two, it really is integral. I mean, they play way above their field weight in the system. They can go to places we can't go for a whole bunch of reasons. And they have some really terrific people. And I just found it was one of the most pleasurable, meaningful parts of my job was working with the Five Eyes. They're just absolutely essential. I remember I was in a meeting, you know that ziggurat in the James Bond movies? Mm-hmm. Well, we were in the top floor where the dining room is, John Scarlett's dining room. And we're having this meeting. It's me, John McLaughlin, Charlie Allen, John Scarlett, who's C, and a bunch of other Brits. And we're having this conversation. I keep saying to myself, I know they're foreigners because they talk funny, but we're having this, it's a really intimate conversation, and it really is an intimate conversation. When you go to one of the sites that we run with the Australians, for example, and you're looking out on the work floor, just a bunch of men and women in polo shirts and khakis. I can't tell you which one's the American and which one's the Australian. It's just a team of people, and they can't, I mean, when they open their mouths, they know. When they were brought back into the alliance, I sort of opened and closed that. They're now playing above their weight in their region. But I can't describe to you how important and how gratifying it is. It's an immensely satisfying relationship. It really is, and it is essential. And if you go to Bletchley Park and you go into this very unimpressive mansion, in the first room on the left side is a plaque saying this is where the special relationship began. It began in this room when we began trading signals information in 1940. I mean, it's here. It's great.
Can I be a little bit provocative and
No, I
ask
never
you
respond.
and ask you about your honest opinion about a lot of our students actually read The Legacy of Ashes?
Oh dear. I know Tim. I've known Tim since he was a reporter in the 80s on the Times. I'll tell you what I told Tim. He and I have talked about it. Tim, nobody can live to your model. His model is if the analysis is not 100% correct, or if the operation is not 100% successful, it's a failure. And I said, Tim, nobody can work to that standard. It's not realistic. He said, oh, did I write that? I said, yeah, you did. And I don't think his new book, The Mission, is a lot better. And I talked with him about it. I know colleagues of ours who wouldn't talk to him about it. And he understands the business. I just don't think the book is very good because he has this totally unrealistic model. You had your hand up. Yes.
Yeah, just to piggyback off what he said, Benjamin Netanyahu recently in an interview said he referred to Israeli intelligence as the sixth eye.
No.
I was wondering.
There's a quote probably from Henry Kissinger. There is no such thing as a friendly intelligence service. There are just the intelligence services of friendly countries. Look, the Israelis, they've spied on us. Hello. Right on them. So no, they are not the sixth eye. The Germans wanted to be the sixth eye, and they were saying, no, this began during the war. That's why we're the French one. Denny Blair wanted to make the French the sixth eye. It's five eyes. It's this British Empire thing, although we have issues with that. And it's English speaking. You never say it in front of the Canadians; they get a bit peeved. But it's not just being admitted to the club. There's this heritage that goes back to 1940, and actually beyond before that, to King George III. And you can't just admit somebody as the sixth eye. It just doesn't work. And no, I wholly disagree. I mean, the Israelis have done some really stupid things to U.S. stuff. I mean, the Pollard case, really, what were you thinking? The Liberty, really? You couldn't see the flags? I'm sorry. So no, I do not agree with that at all. Absolutely not. Yes, sir.
I got a note out for just a moment. First off, I bow to your knowledge of intelligence. I can spell a word, that's about it.
2 L's.
I knew that. I was struck by your remark that some of these bigwigs, the higher level, you mentioned Schultz as a good example, but they don't even have time to stop and think.
Yeah.
How more, rather than Yadron, in the midst of gigantic firefights, still found the time to step back from the firing line to think about what he was going to do with his battalion.
Exactly.
If he can do it, why not somebody at a much higher level?
No, I think your example is well taken. I mean, you're taking fire and you're losing people and it's horrific, and you can stop thinking, what the hell's going on here? Because they don't. They get so overwhelmed with the day-to-day, and they get so overwhelmed with their inbox, and I would say the most of their EAs don't help them with this, that it's just hard to pull back. It's hard to pull back and say, whoa, wait a second, what are we doing here? Are we doing serious work or not? And the battle rhythm, if you will, of policy is such, especially during difficult times like now, that it's just very hard to step back and think. And so they become creatures of their inbox. And I don't have a really, unless you have the fortitude to not do that, like Schultz did, just stop and ask them, where am I going with this stuff? They're not going to do it.
It's pretty scary.
I agree with you. I agree with you completely. But how many of them have a vision? Dean Acheson and Harry Truman had a vision of what they were trying to create. That's why I like Acheson's memoirs, President at the Creation. But how many of these other ones had a vision? Kissinger had a vision of what he wanted to create. I think it was somewhat misshapen, but he had a vision of what he wanted to do. Most of them don't. They don't have that. I also remember elections don't turn on foreign policy. By and large, elections are about domestic referendum. So this is it's never front and center really. So I think it's part of the issue as well. You're not going to get George H.W. Bush, one of the most successful foreign policy presidents in our history, and he gets defeated. Why? Because it's the economy, stupid, right? I mean, after when the war ended, he was at 91%. 91. It's unachievable, and yet 2 years later he's unemployed. And so I think it's part of it. Yes, sir.
Given that our current political leadership seems to be pissing off all our allies, how are the working relationships between the United States and the Five Eyes and others? Is that affected with the current political regime?
Well, since I'm not there, I don't know the answer for sure. I would guess it is not. At the working level continues, and you just sort of let that go, let the turbulence go on at the surface, and you keep doing what you're doing below the surface. I would assume the answer is no, unless you get orders, to stop, don't talk to these people. So I would assume that goes on at a professional level. Would be my best guess, Ray's guess. Yes, ma'am.
Within the book and the different multiple periods that it covers, were any of them particularly difficult to research, either for lack of access to resources or lack of existence of resources?
In the early chapters, I was relying a lot more on secondary work. I mean, I wasn't going to go back to the records of the Continental Army. I know there weren't a lot of records. Actually, there's a really good book on George Washington's expense account, which I had known about, which is really a fun book. Because in there, you can see how much he's spending on intelligence. I mean, he never mentions who it is. That's kind of fun. The chapter on, I think I call it from, it's the chapter from the Civil War, the end of the Civil War to Wilson, the late 19th century. That I had trouble at first giving shape to that chapter. What is this chapter about? So the early part of the chapter is about the closing of from frontier to world power. That's the name of the chapter. You should remember this thing. That chapter, I was having trouble initially saying, what is it about? What am I writing about? And the initial period is about the closing of the frontier and the role of intelligence in the wars on the plains. And then we get to the rise of world powers. I had trouble shaping that chapter initially. I think I pulled it off okay. I reread it. I'm okay with it. That one was a bit difficult. After that, when you get to the modern period, you can drown yourself in documents. And that, then you have too much as opposed to too little. And you have to be, happily, the Foreign Relations series in the United States is all online. So I can do a lot of that in my daughter's house in Chicago and at home. And that was, I have to tell you a funny experience. I was reading the Foreign Relations series, Reagan volume on arms control. And then there's this memo signed by Mark Lowenthal. Now, I shouldn't be surprised. I was a DAS and I signed off on memos, but like, as a historian, it's just really odd to see your name on this document in this book that you're researching. And I read them. I remember the memo. It's relatively classified, but that was sort of odd to me. Just and then the footnote: Mark M. Lowenthal was a deputy assistant secretary. That to me was just odd. There was something weird about that. So that chapter, the late 19th century chapter, I think was the hardest one to give shape to. Right? I think it was, and it's a shorter chapter. And the other thing is the book sort of goes like this. I mean, the early chapters are short, and then you get to 1947, and the chapters get longer. But there's also a lot more going on in the intelligence community. So it's not an evenly shaped book in that sense. And I knew that before I started writing the book. Sorry, in the back. Yeah, you. Yeah.
American intelligence was setting the argument that there was a threat of Russian invasion, which was ignored or not treated very seriously. How does intelligence agency convince the policymakers, not only of the own government, but also of the foreign governments, to treat the assessments as credible?
Well, in the case of the Ukraine buildup, we had lots of imagery of lots of tanks and things which were out there for exercise in Belarus and in I think one of the interesting lessons learned about the Ukraine invasion is it's become probably almost impossible to pull off a secret mass invasion. No, because the ubiquity of overhead imagery, not just Russians and Americans, but everybody. I mean, Google, whatever the hell it is, it's probably become impossible to do that. And Burns went out. First of all, Burns told Putin, "We have the plan. We know what you're going to do. It's really not your best idea," which didn't convince him. No, I think that there's a story during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy sent emissaries to Europe, and Dean Acheson was sent to France to talk to de Gaulle, and he had images of the missiles, and he was about to take them out, and de Gaulle said, "No, the word of the President of the United States is enough for me. If he says there are missiles, there are missiles." So part of, they don't like to teach us in poli-sci, no offense to my friends in poli-sci, it's not about boxes and flowcharts, it's about people. There are people sitting in that box. And when that box changes, and Steve and I have seen this, when the person sitting in the office in the 7th floor changes, the whole building feels it. You can be down in the basement of the building and you feel the fact that the director is a new person. So part of it is personal credibility and personal relationships. And in the case of Ukraine, our intelligence was very, very good, and they decided to share it, and it proved to be true. So this made it easier for the Europeans to come along. It made it easier for Sweden and Finland to drop their neutrality. Obviously, we suffered some credibility during the Iraq estimate. That hurt our credibility for reasons I understand. I had a lot to do with that estimate, but part of it's personal relations. It really is, and there's no way to quantify that, I don't think. Yes.
What do you see the state of civil intel relationship right now? And how can
How do you mean civil intel?
Like civilian intelligence relationship in our country, and how do you see the role of history kind of playing?
When I was the staff director of the Intelligence Committee, my chairman was a congressman from Lubbock, Midlands, Larry Combes, represented what was then the 19th district. And he said to me early on, he said, "You know what Americans want from intelligence?" I said, "No, sir, what's that?" He said, "When they want to know when they go to bed at night, they're going to wake up tomorrow morning in the same country." And one day in September of 2001, we lost that. We woke up on Tuesday morning in one country and we went to bed in another country. And so, most Americans don't give a thought about the intelligence community unless they're paranoid and sleeping with night lights. No, I'm serious about that. Most Americans don't give it a moment's thought to it. They know there's the CIA. Maybe they know there's the FBI, and that's the end of the story. They want to know they can live in a country that's safe and that their civil liberties are not going to be stepped on. And I think that's the basic requirements they have. And as I said, we lost that in 2001, and that changed a lot. But I think basically most Americans, for good or for ill, don't get overly involved in this. I mean, you're not exactly the average American audience, people. Let's face it. You have an interest in this. I mean, and in Washington, it's an inside baseball kind of game. So I think that's the basics. I think Larry was right about that, basically. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. We often think of the public or policymakers having moral qualms with the tactics of the intelligence community. One thing that's interesting in your talk between Simpson's remark about gentlemen looking through mail and Dulles' remark that satellites are cheating,
Right.
that the intelligence community seems to also come across these qualifying tactics. My question is, how has the U.S. intelligence community historically navigated the question of when it comes to have reservations about its own new tactics?
Well, I have to. Steve probably says much more than I know. I know something, but I didn't deal a lot with operations. I wasn't involved in a lot. But when I was in a meeting where they were discussing operations, I was always amazed by how often the ops people would look at the lawyers and say, "Are you sure? Are you double or triple sure I can do this? Because I don't want to go out and do this and be indicted or sent before a committee." I mean, these are not a bunch of Yahoo cowboys waiting to kick down doors. They are people doing incredibly dangerous things that I certainly had no desire to ever do. And they understand that there are limits to what they can do, and they want to make sure they're doing it within the bounds of law. But when I teach my course at Hopkins, I always tell them, look, there are lots of Americans who are, to go back to the question from the woman in the back, who don't like the idea of intelligence agency. They don't like the idea of secrecy. That I don't know where my tax dollars are going. They're doing things I don't approve of, and that's fine. This is America. You're allowed to have that point of view. I don't agree with it, obviously, but it's a legitimate point of view, and there's nothing wrong with it. But they also have the luxury of being in a country where it's safe to do that. So, I mean, you have to, I think that's fine. That's part of the debate. And there are periods when intelligence is seen more positively and periods when it's not. And that's okay, too. But, I mean, we do have morals and ethics. One of the most interesting chapters to me when I write the textbook is the chapter on moral and ethical issues. I find that just a really interesting chapter to write intellectually. And it's an important chapter, but there are rules about this kind of stuff. And we try to adhere to the rule. We don't want to break the law. We understand you're being given license to do something, just like the police are given license to do something, and the military is given license to do something. And you want to do it within legal bounds. And if some people don't like the fact that you're doing it all, that's a legitimate part of the political discussion. Yes, sir.
I want to come back one more time. Please do their advice. Well, if it's not the top policymakers, then who is it, if anyone, that's really doing this strategic thinking? Is it the juniors, the middle managers, the deputies, or maybe people outside of the intelligence community?
There's a percolation up. I know we think about percolators going down. It's a percolator going up. I mean, there's an issue. And one of the interesting and difficult things about U.S. policymaking is everybody has to agree. All the agencies who have a stake in this issue have to agree. So, I mean, we would work on papers until everyone agreed. So, I mean, I'm talking about certain issues. You got to have the Justice Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence people, the State Department, Commerce maybe. Well, they all have to agree. If they don't agree, you're going to spend a lot of time on what are the disagreements. So you try and work as many of those out as you can, and that percolates up to the next level, and you go through this drill again on what's left to do. And there may be people totally at odds. When I worked in the Reagan administration, the people running the Defense Department were basically against arms control. There was an Assistant Secretary of Defense, Richard Pearl, known as the Prince of Darkness, and he was like, there's this Groucho Marx line: "I refuse to join any club that would accept me as a member." Well, that was Richard Pearl's. "I refuse to sign any agreement the Russians will sign." Well, Dick, that's a little limiting, don't you think? And so I worked for the State Department, which believed arms control negotiating was worthwhile. No, I wasn't doing policy, I was doing intel. And we just disagreed. And this went on forever. And then Reagan had an epiphany. Gorbachev becomes the Secretary General of the Communist Party. And Margaret Thatcher has met with him. And she's very close to Reagan. She tells him, "We can do work with this guy. We can do business with this guy." And I remember we had a meeting in the Secretary's conference room, not the Secretary, where there was a working group. Bob Linhart, who was on the NSC, came in and locked the doors. Very ostentatiously. He said, the president's changed his mind. He wants an agreement. What did that just do to the Defense Department's position? Okay, you got two choices here. Fold them and get out, or get on board. So that's part of what you need. If the people on top don't press the system will spin. Until somebody at the top says, I need a decision here. And suddenly we started moving really, really fast. Because Reagan had decided, first of all, Reagan had somebody to negotiate with as opposed to Brezhnev and Chernenko, who were both tomb-like in their last years in office. He had a young man he could negotiate with. And a young man who saw this, Gorbachev was the only Russian Soviet leader born after the revolution, which is interesting. And so suddenly things go fast. So a lot of it depends on that. Where does the leadership want you to go? And then the working group starts working it out. Bismarck said there were two things you should never watch being made. One of them was sausage, the other was policy. There's another thing, you don't ever watch them building a house you're going to live in. That's also scary. I discovered the hard way. Watching the policy process is not a pretty sight. And it's unfortunately not the way it looks in the poli-sci books. It's a lot of give and take. There's a lot of human issues here. A lot of interagency play and bureaucratics. There's a lot of ego going on, and you have to wade your way through that so you get to the end point. I mean, I found it tremendous fun, but it's not pretty. And it's not efficient. It's not built for efficiency. It's built to get everybody on board. So we have agreement. So, I mean, when we were building the NIPF, the priority system, my staff and I did 130 briefings. 130 briefings. So we go into the sit room, and Lieutenant pulls me aside. He says, is this a done deal? I said, absolutely. He said, why are you so damn sure? I said, because after 130 briefings, George, nobody in my row, the back row, is going to goose anybody in your row. He said, okay. He said, it better be. And it was. So we did 130 briefings to get everybody on board. In fact, I told my briefer, Mark Roth, who was a great officer, I said, when you get to briefing 100, I buy you a really good bottle of champagne. And he got his champagne. So he got to 130. There's a lesson in here. You don't make major changes in U.S. intelligence wholesale. I don't stand on Mount Langley and say, I have tablets, children. You do this agency by agency and stakeholder by stakeholder. And that's how the system works. So when I get to that meeting in February of 2003, I know no one's going to dissent because we've done all this. We've done 10 months of spade work. So that's how the system works. As I said, it's not pretty, but it works. Sorry, it was a longish answer. I'm sorry. Yes.
What do you think are the greatest, or the relative strength and weaknesses of the U.S. intelligence system compared to its American allies or adversaries?
I mean, nobody has a system as good as our system. Number one. Number two, it's not perfect. We get stuff wrong. And if you want perfection, we're back to the Tim Weiner book. One of our weaknesses, language. One of the worst things George ever did to me was put me in charge of all the language programs. What a bunch of strange people. Especially the folks at Fort Meade. Hello. We do not have enough people who's, all right, hands up. How many of you have a decent capacity, meaning you can get through the day in a language other than English? And see, the trouble is you're not an average American audience. So we don't have enough people with foreign language skills. And not just the exotic non-Roman alphabet languages. I was talking with Ari about this earlier today. Not just those. Spanish. Hello. We have a few Hispanic Americans around. We could probably use them. French. I mean, because schools don't teach language anymore. I mean, when I was in school, you were going to take language come hell or high water. And no, I understand not everyone is good at language. Remember Hugh Montgomery? Hugh Montgomery was this great intelligence officer. Actually, he was a paratrooper in Normandy. And we were waiting for a meeting to begin. I said, Hugh, Harry's already heard this story. I said, Hugh, how many languages do you speak? He said, 7. I said, 7? He said, yeah, French, German, English, French, German, Italian, Spanish, Russian, Greek, Latin. He said to me, what about you? I said, 2 or 3. He said, well, you're not really trying, are you? but Hugh had this great capacity. So language is a really big issue. The ability to write we were talking about this language, is a really big issue. The ability to write coherent sentences, subject, verb, predicate. If you don't know what those are, go look them up. I don't have time for a grammar lesson here. I know we're putting a lot of emphasis on STEM these days, and yes, STEM is wonderful. I want to know how the North Korean missile works. I want to know what its range is, but I want somebody to tell me what the hell is going on in Pyongyang, and that ain't a STEM question. and you have to be able to think. I used to work with this retired paratroop colonel, and John had on a sign in his office, "Thinking is hard work, that's why so few people do it." You have to be able to think. So, I mean, I think recruitment is still good. Recruitment's been good since 9/11, so I think recruitment is good. I'm not sure how retention is. I think this administration, I don't want to get into politics, but I think this administration made a major mistake when they basically fired all the probationaries. Where the hell are young analysts going to come from? It's like killing your own seed corn. I mean, what's the point of this? I mean, we're going to need older people that are die and retire, or retire and die. Where are my young analysts going to come from? I think that was a huge mistake. I know several of my students at Hopkins had their probationary officers withdrawn. That's kind of daft. So those are some of the requirements. When I worked at INR in state, my ambassador we'd hire somebody new, and Morton would ask two questions. Does she think interesting thoughts, and does she write well? If the answer was yes, he was happy. He didn't care about anything else. Now I'm talking about analysts. I mean, that's I know analysts well. I mean, Steve knows, the dark side of the force. Those some requirements in trouble, and also, requirements change over time. And analysts are not infinitely exchangeable. I mean, a SIGINT satellite doesn't say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I don't do Arabic. I do French, I do German, I don't do Arabic." It's a SIGINT satellite. It does, you've got a vector and all that other crap, but it does zeros and ones. Not every analyst can do every issue. I don't do economics. I seriously mean I don't do economics. I've never taken a macro or micro course in my life. I've never taken a stats course. I'm 77, unlikely to happen now. Once I'm done with supply and demand, I'm done. And what's one of the offices that comes under me in the State Department? Want to guess? Economics. And as long as Melissa was in my room, I was a genius. But I can't do economics. I did a lot of interesting issues. So analysts are not infinitely changeable. So at the end of the Cold War, I have all these Russian analysts. What the hell do I do with them? It's over. A lot of them, I can't retrain them all. A lot of them are in their 50s and 60s. I don't want to spend money retraining them. They're going to leave soon. They left. We spent a lot of time on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism. Islam, what the hell is this about? And now suddenly we're back to the great power stuff. And so now I need analysts who understand Russia and China and North Korea. So you have to, some analysts can change, and others can, and you have to recruit. And it is an all-volunteer force. I can't go down to Texas and say, you, and you, come with me. You're going to work at the CIA. I'll tell you what your job is later. I can only recruit the people who show up at the table. And they may be the people I need, and they may not be the people I need. And if they're not, I got to try and find somebody in the ranks who might be able to do that. So that's always going to be an issue. And what do you do as the agenda changes over time? How do you keep up with that analytically? And it's also part of collection issue, but for analysis, it's a serious issue. How do I keep up with changing issues? And certain countries are just hard targets. North Korea was my poster child hard target. Everything revolves on what's going on in one chubby guy's head. That's the only target. What's going on in Kim's head? I mean, it's a really difficult target. Russia is one target. What's Vladimir thinking tonight? And, we never successfully penetrated the Politburo. We had a lot of spies, Soviet spies. We never got into the Politburo. And so how do you get at those things? There's a CIA phrase, which I never really liked, which sounds horrible. Analytic penetration. It sounds ghastly to me, but you got to just think. You got to sit and think. What do you think's happening here? And then write it in a way. And I always stress this when I'm teaching analysis to my students. When you're writing analysis, you want to stress what you know and what you don't know. And you want the policymaker to know your certainty and your uncertainty. Because if you don't do that, they're going to take what you're writing to the bank and make a bad decision, and that was your fault. You want them to know, this is what we're sure about, this is what we're somewhat sure about, these are unknowns that we don't know. And so that's part of the issue. That's why I think we're good. We're never going to be perfect. We're going to get stuff wrong. But I think we're basically pretty good. And we do have the best service. I really believe that. I'm not saying it because I'm an American. I really think we have the best service. Imagine being an intelligence officer in Russia. Your chances of writing something that doesn't agree with the president is not a good idea. This is not a good way to retire. We do have the luxury of being able to raise questions. You can't do that in an authoritarian state. Sorry, there's a longer answer. Yes, sir.
Are you concerned that there is a growing fear to speak truth to power in the U.S.?
I hate that phrase. I absolutely hate that phrase. I'm not going to pick on you. In fact, I wrote an article about it. Intelligence is not about speaking truth to power. John Mosen said it's about being honest with power. All right, what is truth, as Pontius Pilate once asked, under strange conditions? We don't have truth. So if I'm writing truth to power, and the policymaker disagrees with me, which she's allowed to do, is she committing falsehood? I'm not writing truth. I'm writing my best view of what I think is going on. And it's very rare that we have absolute certainty about what it is. We have high confidence, low confidence, middle confidence. We think this is most likely to happen, less likely to happen, least likely to happen. It's not truth. It's professional estimation, which is not the same thing. And I just think it's a horrible, arrogant phrase. I know it's on the wall in the building. Alan Dulles had it put there, left-hand side as you're going in, but it's not what we're doing. You should read it. Look up my name and Intelligence Not Truth to Power, and you get the entire diatribe in print. It's not our job. Our job is to be honest with power and to tell them what we know and what we don't know. That's our job. It's not the same thing as truth. Yes?
Are you concerned that there's a growing fear to be honest with power?
Yes. That was really good. You look how far in this business, young man. Sign him up. He's good. Yes. I do. I mean, I think in this administration, it's probably more difficult to write something that they don't want to see. But that's, we're back to, hey, if it works, it's my success, and if it fails, it's your fault. Yes, I think it's more difficult now. Yes.
What is your advice to students who want to go into intelligence?
Do it. Do it. Look, I found it as an immensely rewarding career. Steve found it immensely. And he started out as a lawyer. I started as a professor. I'm like, whoa, this is fun. You get to do this. You get to write a paper and go to the Secretary of State. That's kind of cool. Do it. But do it assuming you're going to stay for a while. We don't need people doing touch and goes, as they say in the aircraft carrier business. We need people who are going to be there for a while to do it. And look, I found it immensely rewarding. I felt I was doing something good for the country. I felt, every so often, you see a decision made that you helped support. There was lines in the INFG that I actually wrote. It was funny when my kids were little. My kids are 37 and 33 now. We went to the Air and Space Museum in Washington. And if you're coming off the mall side, there's a Pershing II missile and an SS-20. And as we're walking in, I said to my kids, I helped put those missiles here. And my daughter was like 6, Adam was 3, so she was about 7 or 8. She says to Mom, Daddy moves missiles for a living? And Cynthia said, no, Daddy helped write the treaty that made those museum pieces rather than weapons. It's a good thing. That was really satisfying to me. I helped write that treaty. So I think if that's what you're interested in, do it. By all means, we need new people. Now, obviously, it's difficult in this present time because of the rules about hiring people. But I think if that's what you're interested in, I would really strongly encourage you to do it.
If I can add a layer to Asta's question, we anticipate it may be a year or 2 or 3 or 4 of awkward hiring circumstances, right?
Yes.
So what can students maybe do in the interim to make the most of their time, or to do something like private intelligence? What are some things?
Oh, well, look, there are lots of firms that use intelligence. Defense contractors use intelligence. I mean, there's a whole bunch of firms that do private intelligence. And I mean, breaking and entering, doing analysis, basically. That's what you're interested in. There's a lot of firms that do that. I would hope. I mean, I'm sure that the people in the program can tell you. Google does it. Amazon does it. I mean, they use intelligence. They don't call it intelligence per se, but they're using intelligence. Where's our market? Where is our base? What are we doing about the tariffs? How do we deal with that? So there's lots of other places you can apply your trade other than in the intelligence community until things change, and they will change again. Yeah, absolutely.
This is the last question.
You're the last question, sir. You are. Yeah, I knew. Hello, love to be here. Go ahead.
To expand on some earlier questions, you've played a large role in informing the academic community about the intelligence community. What are some of the challenges of informing the public community, the general public, about the intelligence community, since it often seems misinformed based on scandals perceived or predator or
right. Well, I'm just sure it goes back to the question that a woman in the back asked me about civil and intelligence relations. Part of, I mean, all right, for most people, when you say intelligence, the first thing that comes into the mind is right, picturing James Bond. Seriously, the first thing they think about. Well, I have to, my wife and I were looking at a property in Illinois where my daughter lives, and we were going to make an offer. And this woman said, I looked you up. Weren't you involved in the Iraq estimate? I said, yes, I was. And she was a very liberal Democrat, so we spent 20 minutes in our kitchen where I tried to explain to her, we didn't cause the war. I said, most people, I mean, I go back to the answer I gave here before. This is part of what we do. It's part of what we do to keep people safe, and we want to do it without screwing up your civil liberties. But it is a vital role to keep the country safe and to help policymakers make better decisions. But again, most people don't care. It's below the threshold of the things that they worry about or they're concerned about. Now, obviously, there are lots of people who do care about it, and there's lots of conspiratorial people who write about it and don't know what they're talking about. I mean, that's one of the reasons, what I write is to give people a better sense of what's really, this is really about and what it's not really about. But again, with the public, they're never gonna, the public at large, whatever that means, it's a very large public, are not gonna have day-to-day concerns about this. In Washington you do, but it's a field sport. Washington is this totally anomalous place. There's no international or national news in Washington. It's all local news. And so, I mean, I would hope that Americans understand we do what we do, A, because we're doing it legitimately, we're doing it by law, and we're doing it to keep people safe. That would be the message I hope people take away.
So James Bond is safe.
Yes.
Thanks, Mark.